welcome to camp. Welcome to another edition of Urban Talks. Today we will speak about a very interesting topic, social infrastructure. That's something we don't talk very often, because in Czech Republic we have it. It works, and it's something very common for us. But we will explore if it works all around the world with Eric Klinenberg, American sociologist, author, and director of the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University. He's an author of books Palaces for People and Going Solo, which is not about climbing, as I realized. Hi, Eric. Thank you for joining us.
Hello there. It's nice to be here.
Hi. How are you today?
Well, believe it or not, in addition to the pandemic, today in New York City, we have a historic blizzard that's about to come. We're about to be pounded with snow and wind. So right now I'm okay. 24 hours from now, I don't know.
Okay, so there will be a snowy cover of New Yorker magazine again.
Exactly. It's going to be a white Christmas, as we say here.
Yeah. It sounds wonderful. So I hope you will be all right, and we will have a good connection. So you are now in New York, and as I mentioned, I found out that you have some Czech roots. Can you tell us something about that?
Well, my father's side of the family is from Prague, and I've only been able to visit once, but it's a Jewish family, and so I was able to visit the Jewish quarter, and it was really going into one of the synagogues in Prague, where they have the list of the names of families, where members were taken to concentration camps. I saw my family's name there. It was really shocking and surprising. I wasn't in that mindset. But the family wound up leaving Europe for the most part, and is mainly in the United States. But I'm hoping to come back to the Czech Republic sometime, maybe for another one of these talks when we're back to the world where we're seeing each other in person. Imagine that.
Yeah, we would be really happy to see you here and show you our center. That's a very interesting fact, and it's not happening very often that we have someone with a connection to Prague in Urban Talks. So thank you for this icebreaker, and I will ask you for a presentation for your talk. It's yours.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm really looking forward to the conversation today. I'm going to speak a little bit about a book I wrote that's called Palaces for the People. I think you can see an image of it here, and then hopefully we have some time for conversation. And it's a book about what I call social infrastructure, and how it shapes our experience in the world, our capacity to connect with each other, and to build bridges. And when we talk about building bridges here in the United States, we do it in the context of a government that's still very much intent on building walls. And I think that's changing. But for the last many years, we've been a society that's more focused on walls than bridges. And this is a problem I want to discuss. And to get us into this conversation, I want to begin by, just showing you this image. I don't know how strongly you heard this idea where you are, but when the pandemic got going in the United States, we were told that the way that we were going to survive was by socially distancing ourselves from other people. This actually is an idea that came from the World Health Organization in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic. The idea was, since we didn't have a vaccine and there wasn't any great medication, the way that you stay alive during a pandemic is to be socially distant. And I don't know if that's the same concept that you used in the Czech Republic, but many societies around the world pushed this idea. Many governments did. And on the one hand, when I heard this idea, social distancing, I understood what the World Health Organization was trying to advance. I got that project and the significance of staying apart from other people to protect them during a health crisis that involves an infectious disease. The problem that I realized very quickly is that it's not really social distancing that keeps us safe and protected during a pandemic. It's physical distancing, right? It's not that I'm going to expose other people to risk by being socially close to them. It's that being physically close is dangerous, right? Because it's when you have physical proximity, physical closeness, that you can cough on someone or sneeze on someone or talk or laugh and send particles into the air that infect other people. Physical closeness is dangerous. Social closeness is actually necessary, right? What I got concerned about is the message that we were sending to the world is, if you want to survive this horrible pandemic, close your door, bunker down, hunker down in your apartment, cut off the rest of the world, take care of yourself, and everything will be fine on the other end. And it struck me that this was a recipe for disaster, because there's nothing like the current pandemic to show us the extent to which our fate is linked to the fate of our neighbors. And no matter how wealthy we are, no matter how educated we are, there are limits as to how much we can protect ourselves if we live in a society with a division of labor. So for instance, if you live in a society that says to workers, if you're sick and you need to stay home from work, don't worry about it, that's the right thing to do. We're going to make sure that you have a guaranteed income, and you're not going to lose your job because you stay home when you're sick, then you stay home. But imagine you live in a society like the United States where some workers get that protection, but a lot of workers don't have that protection by law. What happens is, if you're sick, you realize, if I don't go to work today, I'm not going to get paid, or I might lose my job. And so here we've done studies showing that even people in the US who work in the food service industry are much more likely to come to work when they're sick than in other countries. And so if you have the early stage of a pandemic and you have a society that's not taking care of each other, you can encourage people to go to work. Same if we think about kind of solidarity in the education system. Imagine you've got a society that doesn't invest enough in basic education so that people can't tell the difference between a new coronavirus that's potentially lethal and the ordinary flu. So that when a political leader says, this is not a big health problem, this is just the flu, don't wear a mask, you're going to be fine. If you haven't invested in the education of the people who live around you, if you haven't built that line of solidarity, they won't wear a mask. They'll refuse to do basic things to protect themselves. And you yourself, no matter how educated you are, no matter how wealthy you are, you will wind up more vulnerable. And so my view is this social distancing message was really distracting and dangerous. This is a moment where we need more social solidarity. Physical distance, yes. Social distance, no. Social solidarity more than ever, right? And I want to explain that this is an idea that I've been working on, something I've been thinking about for many decades now, because my career as a social scientist began when I wrote a book about a heat wave in 1995 that hit the city where I grew up, Chicago, and more than 700 people died alone during this heat wave. And what was really powerful about the disaster is, not just that so many people died in a short period of time from something that seemed pretty innocuous, the heat. It's that so many people died by themselves alone. So social isolation during the heat wave was really a killer, because when there's extremely hot weather, what you need to stay alive is really just someone knocking on your door and seeing that you're in trouble, and taking you into a place where there's air conditioning, or giving you cool water even can make the difference between life and death. And we live in a world where there's more people who are living alone and socially isolated than ever before. And so this turned out to be a real problem in Chicago. What was striking when I wrote my book about the heat wave is that there's a bunch of infrastructures that we ordinarily look at when we try to understand the fate of a society, like the transit infrastructure or the energy infrastructure, water, communications. They're these basic fundamental infrastructures that seem to determine our fate. But when I looked at a map of Chicago, there was no relationship between the experiences of different neighborhoods and the quality of this kind of traditional infrastructure. That did, whether the trains were working, even whether the power was on or off, didn't have a strong relationship to death as much as I thought it would. But what really mattered in the heat wave in Chicago was the social infrastructure. And when I say social infrastructure, I want to be clear, I'm not talking about like the health sector or the education sector. I define social infrastructure in my work in a more narrow and specific way. I'm referring to the physical places that shape our capacity to interact with each other. Sidewalks, playgrounds, libraries, parks, schools, places like this that physically give us an opportunity to be with each other. Or if the social infrastructure is not designed well, or if it breaks down, if it's not maintained, if it's not built well, if it falls apart, if you live in an environment like that, you're more likely to kind of hunker down. And so what you're looking at here is a neighborhood on the south side of Chicago called Englewood. And you might be tempted to think, oh, look at all the green space here. This is a nice natural area, but actually what you're looking at is a block in Chicago in a very poor neighborhood where there's been wide scale depletion and abandonment. There used to be houses on the blocks that you're looking at right now, and the houses fell apart and were burned down or knocked down by the city. And these are empty lots that were abandoned, and they're very scary places for most residents who live around them because no one is really controlling the physical space. They're not planned or programmed or designed. And blocks like this, a physical landscape like this in an American city tends to attract a lot of crime. It's very difficult for neighbors to feel safe and secure around it. So the people who lived in Englewood in Chicago during the heat wave, if they lived around a place like this, they tended to hunker down in their homes and to stay home as a survival strategy. There's not a lot of hanging out on the block, especially if you're an older person or a more frail person. The way you stay safe is to stay at home. And meanwhile, across the street, literally across the street from Englewood, there's a neighborhood called Auburn Gresham. And what I should tell you is both of these neighborhoods, this one here, Englewood, and this one here, Auburn Gresham, they're both very poor neighborhoods. They're both almost entirely Black or African American. High levels of older people who are living alone. Demographically, they're similar in many respects. But what was amazing, and what no one else had really noticed before I did this work on my research, is that the death rate during the heat wave in this neighborhood, Englewood, where the social infrastructure had really kind of broken down and fallen apart, was 10 times higher than the death rate in this neighborhood, Auburn Gresham, even though demographically they look very similar. And like I said, they're literally located across the street from one another. I thought that was kind of amazing. And it turns out, like, if you live in a neighborhood like this in Chicago, even if it's a very poor neighborhood, even if it's segregated, people who live in this neighborhood have a tendency to hang out. They sit on those stairs that you're seeing. They say, we call them stoops. They'll sit on the stoop and socialize with each other. They walk the block for exercise. And the older people, even people who are frail, they'll be out as well on daily routines. And so what happens if you live in a neighborhood like this is that if there's a crisis happening, if there's a heat wave or a blizzard, and a person you're used to seeing outside every day isn't outside, you think to yourself, oh, there's something must be wrong. I should go knock on the door and check up on my neighbor. And people have a way of interacting with each other and supporting each other because the culture that's supported by the social infrastructure allows that. Whereas if you live in a neighborhood that looks like this, you don't see your neighbors at the same level. You don't gather in the same places. I should tell you that Englewood also does not have a lot of, community organizations at the time, does not have coffee shops and diners and places where people congregate, playgrounds on a regular basis. And so here, if you stay home in a heat wave, people don't notice as much. It's not that they don't care. It's not that they don't like each other. It's not that they don't have the same values. They do. When you talk to people about what it means to be a neighbor, they say the same kinds of things in both places. It's that a neighborhood that looks like this has a depleted social infrastructure that leads to more isolation. And a neighborhood like this has a more robust social infrastructure that leads to a kind of a density of social life. Now, some of you are probably thinking, oh, well, that's true for a heat wave, but imagine during a deadly pandemic, maybe in a situation like this, it could be very dangerous to be in a place that's social. And that's an interesting question. It's something that we're looking into right now. One of the signs we've seen so far in the US is that in the early days of the COVID pandemic, people who lived in neighborhoods that were more thick socially, that had a more robust social infrastructure, did in fact get infected at a higher rate and did in fact have more vulnerability. But that as information circulated and people became more aware of the risks of COVID and how to contract it, people who lived in places like Auburn Gresham became more active at maintaining physical distance and learning how to support each other with mutual aid networks and things like that than people who lived in places like this. But that's an ongoing research concern. So as I said, coming out of this experience in the heat wave, I got very interested in this idea that one reason that we don't think much about social infrastructure when it comes to the design of cities or to the planning of cities or to the functioning of cities during crises and also every day is that we don't have a concept for it. We didn't really, we haven't used this language before. So when it comes to planning and setting policies and trying to understand how to make a neighborhood work, infrastructure refers only to those old hardline technological systems and not to social infrastructure as I've defined it. And so that's why I wrote this book. That's why I introduced this terminology, and it's really kind of changed the way that I understand how places operate. We've been in Chicago for the last few minutes. I've been telling you about the city where I grew up, but I took my interest in social infrastructure to New York City, which is where I've lived for the last 20 years. I teach at New York University. I run something called the Institute for Public Knowledge, and I became the director of this institute in the summer of 2012. And when I became the director, I announced that we were going to start doing a lot more work on cities and climate change. And we're really going to be thinking about, how to help cities adapt, how to help cities decarbonize, how to help cities take some leadership in the fight against climate change. And this was in the summer of 2012. And a few months later, in October of 2012, a hurricane called Sandy hit New York. And very quickly, Manhattan looked like this. And I imagine very few of you have seen images of the heat wave in Chicago before today, but probably a lot of you have seen images of Sandy because it was a kind of global historic event, and it hit the kind of the power corridor of the United States. It hit New York, and to be honest, it was really unimaginable to most Americans that Manhattan could ever look like this, because the place that's blacked out, the place that has no power, is really the financial center of the universe. We're looking at the capital of capitalism, and I think everyone thought before Sandy that New York was better protected and better prepared for extreme weather than it was. And when this happened, we lost power at New York University, and as soon as it came back on, I organized a whole series of meetings, kind of public events where people could process what was happening in the city and talk about the future. And I organized a bunch of research projects where people were going around New York and trying to understand what was happening. And I wrote an article in the New Yorker magazine about what had happened in New York during Sandy. And a few weeks later, I got a call from the Obama administration. And I don't know if any of you remember that we used to have this guy named President Obama in the United States. Do you remember that at all? I don't know if that registered over there, but we call that the age of reason, that period of American history. And the Obama administration was really concerned about 21st century challenges, they weren't trying to build 6th century technologies like walls. They were thinking about like, how do we create a society that's robust enough for 21st century threats, including pandemics, including climate change. And they came up with this idea that since the government had funded about $50 billion to the region that was affected by the hurricane to recover, that they would do a design competition internationally and ask teams of engineers and architects and landscape architects and city planners to come up with ideas for how to rebuild the region. And to my great surprise and delight, the Obama administration invited me to be the research director for that project. And my job in this competition, which got 150 applications from design teams around the world, and 10 teams were selected as finalists. And my job as the research director was to kind of take these teams around the region to different places and introduce them to the different needs and vulnerabilities and possibilities in all kinds of places. And so what was unique about this design competition is that before a team could even submit an idea for a proposal, they had to go through a 9-month process that involved 3 months of research and 3 months of outreach with stakeholders in different communities and 3 months of participatory design. And until they did all of that, they couldn't submit anything to a jury. And so it was a very hands-on, intense approach. And we were talking to teams about, how to conceive of different risks and how to connect their projects to the everyday vulnerabilities in the area. And we were very committed to 2 big ideas in this competition. One was that teams should do everything possible to make sure that if they are proposing a solution to a climate problem, that in addition to protecting a community from an emergency situation like a hurricane or a heat wave, their design ideas should also benefit places every day. Right? So the notion is if you're going to invest in systems that are going to provide security or protection during a crisis, don't make it so they only work 1 day out of 365 days a year. Try to come up with ideas that will work well for people they're going to shape all day, every day, regardless of the weather. So that was one principle. And the other principle was that they should do that with social infrastructure. That when they were designing an infrastructure system, even if they were trying to build a wall to keep water out from a low-lying area of a city, they should think about how that system could also promote social life in some meaningful way, right? So don't just design security infrastructure, design social infrastructure at the same time. And this was a very big challenge for the teams. I should say there's a third mandate also, which is that they had to think about equity or inequality when they were designing things. And we were really encouraging the teams to promote design ideas and push design ideas that would affect people who were vulnerable rather than people who were very wealthy, because we have a problem in the United States, which is that oftentimes, very powerful constituencies take hold of processes like this and wind up using public money to protect themselves. So we wind up using disaster relief to make the society as unequal as it was before, if not more unequal, rather than using disaster relief to promote equality. And we wanted to work on this. But these are all big challenges. And I want to tell you what, one of the really memorable experiences I had is that there was a day when I was working with a team of terrific designers who had done a lot of work after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, in the area around New Orleans. And they were really struggling to come up with a plan that was ambitious and kind of exciting enough to win this competition. And I want to remind you that there were about $2 billion of money at stake. So there's really serious consequences to how well your design idea came out. And they're really struggling. And they came up to me one day and they said, Eric, we finally come up with this idea that we're excited about. It's called a resilience center. We want to design this thing called a resilience center. can we tell you about it? And I said, yeah, it sounds interesting. I mean, if you follow the climate change debate, you know that people are talking about resilience all the time. It's one of those buzzwords. The idea that we want to help communities bounce back, and we want to help cities, recognize their vulnerability and be able to come back better. And it's one of those buzzwords that I'm always very suspicious about, because it's vague and it's hard to define. But everyone's talking about it, and I wanted to hear what they meant. And they said, well, imagine that we had a public building that was a resilience center, and we would have a prototype in one neighborhood, and but then maybe we could scale it up, and you could even imagine a resilience center in every neighborhood across the United States or even around the world. And I said, well, what would a resilience center look like? And they said, well, imagine a building that's designed to be a kind of home away from home, for everyone who lives near it. And it would be open 6 or 7 days a week. It's a public building. It would be staffed by these, public employees, resilience experts, and their job would be to be aggressively welcoming to everyone around, keep the doors open, let everyone know they're welcome. The building would have a lot of different rooms, and they would be programmed for different kinds of users. So, we want everyone to think of the Resilience Center as a home away from home, but the people who are going to use it the most are people whose lives are most rooted in the neighborhood. So older people and very young people, like young children. And so, like they said, imagine for the kids, we have story time in the morning and reading hours and sing-alongs and things like that. And they said, we know the kids don't just come to the Resilience Center by themselves. They they'd be taken by grown-ups. And so for the grown-ups, we would have comfortable seating, and maybe we'd have Wi-Fi access and tablets and books and magazines and things like that. And then for the older adults, we would have current events classes and book groups, and we'd show films occasionally and maybe do crafts courses. And they said, the idea is that people would go to these places all the time. They'd be able to go 365 days a year. And then if there was a crisis, like if there's a big blizzard or a hurricane, a heat wave, and people need a place to gather, everyone would come to the Resilience Center because it would feel like a second home. They'd know the staff, they'd know each other. They'd say, what do you think? And I thought about it. I thought, like, this is a really interesting idea. I like the way you're thinking about having a community center like this. But I also said to them, have you ever heard of a library? Because you might have a different system in the Czech Republic, but in the United States, we have these neighborhood libraries. We call them branch libraries that exist in basically every neighborhood. And my sense was that, without meaning to, this very talented design group had basically reinvented the wheel. And they were proposing something that looked more or less like what the library already looks like. And you're looking right now at one of my favorite neighborhood libraries in New York. It's on the Lower East Side, which is a kind of historic immigrant community. And it's a classic Carnegie library. My book is called Palaces for the People because Andrew Carnegie, who was not really the greatest man in the history of the world, but certainly a very wealthy man, was a great philanthropist, kind of a ruthless capitalist and very tough on his workers, but also gave the equivalent of about $2.5 billion of his private wealth to help build about 2,500 libraries around the world. And he wanted them to be called, what he thought of them as palaces for the people. The idea was that libraries would be open and accessible to everyone. They would have these kind of high ceilings and big windows. You can kind of see it in this building here. Then many of the libraries have steps coming up to them, so that you're literally exalting yourself when you walk into a library. They were, often in neighborhoods where people were working in factories and living in really tight apartments. And the library was a place in Carnegie's imagination where you could make something more of yourself, where you could kind of improve yourself, learn things, advance in your life and career. A palace for the people. And it just really struck me that like the libraries already are playing this role and not really getting the appreciation they need. In fact, there's a notion in the United States, which I've now heard in other societies too. It's an issue in the UK of this idea that, maybe the library is obsolete as an institution. We live in a world where we all carry these phones everywhere we go. We have Amazon and ebooks and internet news outlets. So who needs the library after all? But in neighborhoods across the United States, libraries are really important gathering places. They're vital social infrastructure, as well as places where people can get information. So this is just about a block from the library that I just showed you. And what I'm showing you in this image is that this Lower East Side neighborhood, which historically has been a place for immigrants and very poor people, has become a site for gentrification. As I have a lot of urban neighborhoods that have this kind of extraordinary character. And so, if you're the kind of person who wakes up in the morning and says to yourself, where can I find an ice cream cone that costs 12 euros and where they only have the flavor salt? This is where I'm going to go to the Lower East Side in the morning, because this is the kind of thing you find is kind of this very boutique-y, very expensive set of places. And what that means, if you live in a neighborhood that's gentrifying, is many people who've lived there a long time start to feel priced out, like the neighborhood is not a place where they belong anymore. There's coffee shops that don't take cash. They only accept a credit card, which sounds very cool, except for that, not everybody has a credit card. A lot of people live in a cash economy. And so you find this kind of strange thing where there's a set of low-level places like McDonald's and fast food places that are gathering places for the poor. And there's a sign in the corner, I don't know if you can see it, that says "No loitering, please." That means don't stay. You can stay here for 30 minutes. And the kind of gathering places in the private market often say this if they serve a lot of poor people. I could probably walk into this McDonald's with my computer and sit there for about 10 hours before anyone would say anything to me, because I'm a white guy and a professional and the right social class. But if you're sitting there and you're a poor person, if you're a Black person, they're going to ask you to leave after 30 minutes, even if you've ordered something. And so it's not really hospitable either. But what's extraordinary about the library, and here you can see those stairs that are taking you up from your daily plane of existence into this higher ground. What's notable about the library is it's a genuinely welcoming and accessible institution. It really is. It's free for all people. And it's one of the very few places in American society. If the United States ever becomes an attractive place and a safe place to visit again, if we're ever able to get beyond this pandemic, I really encourage you to come and visit a library when you're here, because they're extraordinary places to see on the inside. You really get a feel for all the different kinds of people here. And they're a kind of rare place where there's a mixing of people from different ethnic groups and social classes and different ages. There are not a lot of institutions that look like this, and we have it by design. And so it's really vital that you have a social infrastructure that operates this way. And it's interesting. If you spend time around the library, you see this daily routine where of all these different kinds of people who want to come in and have this experience. Young people are especially important patrons of libraries. I love this image here. If you look at it closely, this is a girl who's come to the library with her mother, and she's holding in her hand a book. Curious George is kind of a famous comic educational book that kids read here, but she also has, maybe you can see it, a card in her right hand. There's a red card, and the red card is her library card. And in the United States, your library card is something you can get at, basically at any point in your life. And for many of us, it's the first document or thing we get from the government that registers you as a person who has rights and privileges. I mean, we get a birth certificate when we're born, and some of us get a passport if our parents get it, or a social security card, but those things go into a drawer somewhere and we never use it. The library card becomes like your first piece of identification that also gives you access to a government institution and to resources, because what happens when you get your card is you can start to take out books. And when you take out a book in the library, this interesting thing happens. You figure out first that the state is there to give you something that's good for you, that you're going to enjoy. But also you learn that you can bring it home and keep it, but you have to bring it back because other kids also want to read that book. And you can start to see yourself in relation to those other kids. And you think not only about the fact that you have a book that someone else wants, but when you finish Curious George 1 or Harry Potter 1, maybe you want to read Curious George 2 or Harry Potter 2. And you're only going to be able to read Curious George 2 or Harry Potter 2 if another kid returns their book. So you learn about the way in which you're embedded in a community of other citizens that flourishes only if they have each other in mind, right? And so here we start to see the way in which a library is not just a physical place, a social infrastructure, it's also a programmed place, right? It has a program, it has a set of activities it supports that helps us discover who we are, how we're connected to other people, and how our fate is linked. Right? So go back to the story about people dying alone in a heat wave because the neighbor's not knocking on your door, or people who die in a pandemic because their neighbors refuse to wear a mask. I don't want my freedom disrupted, and I want to be free enough that I can wear a mask no matter what it does to you. That's not an idea that's consistent with the idea you learn in the library, right? Which is, I only get Harry Potter 2 if you return Harry Potter 2, so I'm going to make sure I return Harry Potter 1, and we can all support each other. Those things, those lessons don't happen naturally. And they don't just happen in our families. They happen in the sphere of civic life, and they happen when we build social infrastructure. Another amazing thing that happens in libraries, and you can see it in other places like parks and playgrounds as well, is that we learn to engage with people who are different from us, people who we might not encounter on a regular basis, right? So we sing songs in another language. We see people who look different. We learn that even though we're really enjoying being pushed on the swing set in the playground, there's another kid waiting for that swing set, and they deserve a turn too. And sometimes we even get to do that without our parents or our babysitters taking care of the situation and forcing us to do it. At some point, we learn to do that on our own, or we don't. Libraries also represent something really special in the United States. They're places where people learn to become citizens. They teach English as a second language more than any other public institution. They teach citizenship courses. They provide companionship for older adults. Many years ago, there was a book called Bowling Alone by a political scientist named Robert Putnam that was very popular in the United States. And the thesis was that Americans are growing farther and farther apart, that we've become more isolated, that we suffer from ennui. And I came into some libraries in New York that do this thing called the Library Lanes Bowling League. And what you're looking at are older people at a library in Brooklyn. And once a week, they put on these jerseys, these blue shirts, and they hook up an Xbox to a TV set, and they have virtual online bowling competitions against the teams from other libraries. So they're, instead of, these are the people who in Chicago would have been home and alone, right? They're older, they're poor, they live in segregated neighborhoods, and the library is a place where they go to be with each other and even to experience this thing that sociologists call collective effervescence. They experience a lot of happiness that they might not experience otherwise, right? And so here's the opposite of the bowling alone idea. You see these faces, the smiles, the laughter, the camaraderie. These things don't happen naturally. These things don't just happen because people have a cultural taste for being together. You need a physical infrastructure, a social infrastructure that supports sustained, recurrent collective activity, or you suffer alone. So I bring all this up because we live in a time where in many countries in the world we're in a regime of austerity, and I fear that one consequence of the pandemic is that public finances are strapped, and states believe that they're going to have to cut a lot of things that used to be deemed essential services. There's not as much money for transit and for schools and for parks and for playgrounds and for libraries. And in fact, not long ago, an economist in the United States wrote this article saying, he said, libraries are obsolete. And he said, until you show me the cost benefit analysis that proves that libraries are delivering more benefits, than they're costing taxpayers, I suggest that we knock down libraries throughout the United States. We should literally, knock them down or sell them off. And we should replace the library with Amazon stores. We should replace libraries with Amazon stores. And I've been thinking in the context of the pandemic, when libraries have done so much to try to keep their communities going, offering virtual classes, providing Wi-Fi access, expanding their electronic offerings, their digital offerings for people who can't go and get physical books. How different that is than the Amazon model, because probably no company on earth has profited more from the pandemic than Amazon. I could be wrong about that. I don't know if that's true, but Amazon's value has gone through the roof. Jeff Bezos has become massively more wealthy while the rest of the world suffers. And think about what it would be like if we were relying on this kind of ravenously hungry company seeking profits at every turn, rather than a public institution that promoted something like the public good during this moment. And yet, in the UK, libraries are closing. In the US, there's a push to reduce their hours, to reduce their staff, to reduce the number of days that they're operating. And I show you this because I believe that we face a real crisis. We face a crisis of rebuilding when this pandemic is over, not just in the United States, but around the world. This is a sign showing some of the things that libraries have been doing during the pandemic when the buildings were closed. And I imagine, how do we get through the kind of crisis that we're living in right now without an institution like the library, or without social infrastructure generally, or without places that bring us together, whether it's a library or a park or a playground or a schoolyard or an athletic field. Where are the places where we have some capacity to come together? And how do we get out of this moment where we're hunkered down, where we're isolated, where we're dependent on technologies like this to be together? And, look, I don't know how you feel about it, but on the one hand, I feel very happy that we can be here, on our Zoom seminar today. It's a great technology that allows me to speak to you in the Czech Republic, even while I'm in New York City. And thank goodness that we can be here. But on the other hand, I really can't wait for the moment where I can get on a plane and come visit you and meet you in person. And I can't think about all the conversations that I could have had if I were there, that all the things that we would do together to get to know each other, to make plans for future projects, to build collaborations, to think about next ideas, how to learn from each other, and just the pleasure of each other's companionship that we don't get here in this world on Zoom. And we all know that at this very moment while we're here in Silicon Valley, in Tel Aviv, in the tech hubs of the world, companies are trying to figure out how do they keep us here on our screens even after the pandemic ends? How do we make sure that people stay on our screens after the pandemic ends? And what I'm interested in is how we find ways to come back together after, so that we're liberated from the screen a little bit, and we can begin to rediscover the pleasures of being together in person in real life. And the argument I made is that when we get out of this, we will be talking about a Green New Deal and a New Deal and building infrastructure and, putting people back to work and remaking our cities. And my plea for you, and this is where I'll end, is that when we think about a 21st century city and all the amazing infrastructure that it could have, let's definitely think about, better transit systems and 5G technology and cool bridges and, electrical grids that run on renewable energy. We need all of those things. But let's make sure that we recognize and appreciate, invest in, and rebuild around social infrastructure as well. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your talk. It was pretty interesting, and I really enjoyed those things you said about libraries in the United States. When we started, I said that it works here, libraries, and it's true. But the system is different, and I think that our relation to libraries is different. I have to say that when I see some, a Hollywood movie, it's typical that the heroes of the movie or characters are moving somewhere around the libraries. It's typical for American movies that time to time the main character goes to library or talking about the libraries. Young people go there, and they are always bigger than us, than our libraries. For us, it's not the meeting point, not the social infrastructure and the at the context, as you said. They are not that beautiful, they are not that big, but they are everywhere, almost everywhere, on every corner. Every district has its own small library, and they are connected in Prague, and it works same in other cities, but they are not part of the pop culture. They are part of the education. They are something like the most basic layer of the education, of the culture, but they are not something that we describes ourselves. So, is that connection to libraries all around the United States, or it's just in New York? Are those systems developed all around the United States?
It's definitely not New York. It's a phenomenon that you find throughout the United States. You see it in conservative areas, in small towns, in suburbs, and also in big cities. Is really a big part of American culture. It's also true in many different societies. This is actually what you're looking at now is a library that's in Nova Scotia in Canada. You probably know that one of the most exciting libraries in the world right now is in Helsinki in Finland. A lot of European countries are investing in extraordinary libraries that are 21st century social infrastructures and gathering places. My book is actually not mainly about libraries. It covers a lot of different kinds of social infrastructure, and clearly different societies use different social infrastructures in their own ways. So some Arab cities, you find the souk, the kind of marketplace is more of like a central social infrastructure. In Iceland, the hot pot, the swimming pools, steam baths are really important civic infrastructure. In Sweden, people like to use the sauna. And so there are a lot of different kinds of places that are famous gathering places. My family lived in Buenos Aires for a while, and it was soccer or football field. It was a gathering place. There are different kinds of places. Libraries are very special when you can invest in them because they are really built around the mission of promoting open societies and democratic culture. They have a tendency to bring out the best in us. They are programmed. They have these magical people called librarians. And so I have seen a number of European countries that had more narrow history with the library as a more academic institution expand their use of the library as a social infrastructure. And so it's the kind of thing that you could be thinking about more in the Czech Republic. But I want to be clear that my point here is not that there's one great social infrastructure called the library and everything else is secondary. There are a lot of different things that shape our way of being together. And you said at the beginning of the talk that this is actually not an issue in the Czech Republic. I'm curious about that. You said, and here we have great social infrastructure. I've been to some places and I see that, but is that really true that you feel that in the Czech Republic now, there's no problem with supporting gathering places for different people, and everyone feels like they have access to a kind of open and tolerant and generous public space?
I found out. Sorry, it was that question because I have some problem with the connection.
Oh, sorry. Well, don't worry.
Yeah. Sorry. I'm
asking you about social infrastructure.
I'm sorry. There was a. Yeah. Sorry. I didn't hear the question. So,
it's
but
okay.
I will try to ask another question. I'm sorry for that. Maybe there will be time later. I read one interview with you for City Lab, and you mentioned interesting term, third places. I would like to ask you if you can describe what the third place is and what's the second place, if we are talking about social infrastructure, and if you can describe us these terms.
So these are concepts that come from a writer named Ray Oldenburg, who wrote a book called The Great Good Place. And the way he thinks of it is your first place is your home, your second place is your workplace, and the third place is like the place where you hang out, your social place. So maybe in England, it's the pub, or maybe in Buenos Aires, in Argentina, it's the football pitch.
In Czech Republic is the pub too.
I think it's probably the pub everywhere, but the pub. But the third place is your place where you build your social life, and a place where is like a kind of home away from home for you. And you could say that there are third places that are private institutions, like a restaurant or a bar, right, a pub. And there's also third places that are public institutions, like a library or a park. And my book focuses more on the public institutions than on the private institutions, because as citizens in democracies, we have more capacity to shape those places than we do to shape the private sector institutions.
Yeah. So can I imagine a library something as a safe place? When I'm not happy or comfortable at home right now, I can go to a library. If I can't go to a job, to my workplace, because it's, for example, pandemic, I can go to a library. And if I can't hang out with other people during the pandemic, for example, I can meet someone in library, or I can say that library will care about me. It's something like that.
Very much, yes, very much. And maybe people will notice if you're not there. If you use it enough.
Yeah, and I would like to ask you about another kind of those places, like a community centers, because you mentioned gentrification, and we have this trend in Prague. It's something like chain reaction, because you can do some redevelopment in the district that was poor and ugly, for example, and now it became trendy and it's more expensive with nice flats. But when everything is in the private sector and everything is private owned, it's very difficult to find out the way how to build a community center, to build a library, and make former residents feel better there. Do you have some example or recipe how to fight with gentrification with these community centers, but different than libraries? If there is some recipe or example from all around the world or from United States?
Well, I mean, this is a very difficult problem. I mean, gentrification is a very difficult problem because it's very difficult to stop it, and there's still a debate in the world of people, studying cities about how it affects the people who were living there before. There's some research that shows that in the United States, when a neighborhood is getting gentrified, a lot of the people who were there before, if they are able to stay, they enjoy the neighborhood more because the services get better, the amenities get better. The problem is that a lot of people get displaced and we don't track their experiences, and so we don't know what happens to them as much. And also people find it harder to stay. Like you grow up in a neighborhood and you have children there. Maybe you can afford your apartment because you've been there a long time, but your kids can't live near you, or your friends can't live near you. So that's a different kind of pain, and it's very tricky to manage that without stopping growth. And the problem has always been, how do you improve the quality of life in a neighborhood, improve the services, improve the commercial possibilities without gentrifying, right? Without bringing in a class of new people who bring more money. And that's really tricky. So what I've noticed about, places like libraries or community organizations, parks, playgrounds, is that they can work well as social bridges to at least, improve relationships between people, the old timers and the newcomers, but they will work better if they're programmed by people who are aware of the conflicts and have some capacity to organize people together to seek out common ground. And in the absence of that kind of programming, people who are really dedicated to thinking about the conflicts that are inevitable and helping people to identify them and talk through them, problems have a way of taking over the situation. So like, who is the equivalent of the librarian for the public park or for the playground, or for the community center? And, have people come together to think about the collective as something that's larger than the interests of, any particular family or group. And that's the stuff that democratic life is made of. And there's no easy solution to it. The question is how we deal with those challenges as they come up. And I think some societies have done much better than others. And, clearly, when you have runaway inequality, and some people are just kind of extraordinarily affluent and secure, and other people are just getting by or not getting by at all, it's much harder to have anything like social cohesion and mutual support because there's a lot of antagonism and distrust.
Did you find some difference between the the will of working for a community or working together on the development of the public space or the community itself, between the I will say the poor people, the former residents, or the newcomers. From the higher middle class, if they are connected with the neighborhood in the same way, or if there is a different way how they work with the community, for the community.
Honestly, there's so much variation here. It's hard to say. So I can't say that I have a pattern for you. There are differences across New York City in that question, and there's clearly differences across the United States.
Yeah.
But I will say that I think the question for us moving forward is how we learn from this experience that we've had during this historic crisis. And I think for me, one of the very clear lessons of the United States has been that we cannot survive. We literally cannot survive through the threats of the 21st century if we're not more invested in things called public goods, and if we're not more aware of the ways in which our fates are linked inevitably and inextricably to the fates of people around us. The idea that you can protect yourself by building a wall and putting yourself on the safe side, I think is a dangerous fantasy. And I think this experience that we've had really reveals that. And I guess your question is, to what extent are people becoming aware of that, and to what extent do we see people, doing it better or worse? And I think right now it's too early to say. I don't know what the pattern is. But I do think that our capacity to deal with, after the pandemic, we squarely are facing climate change, our climate crisis. And there again, it's, you can't get through it if you just want to protect yourself. We have to look for those shared interests.
Yeah. Do you have some input about the public transport? If there is some, influence of public transportation and distances between those community centers, libraries, if it's better, if it works better, if they are more successful, if they are connected to public transport, or if it works also good, if they are just, because I would like to ask you about the difference between the city like Manhattan or New York, where everybody use the public transport, and cities or districts like you showed us from Chicago, where they are, it's more about cars, it's more about traveling cars. This is our point of view if we are talking about the urban sprawl and this stuff in Czech Republic, because we don't have that problem. We don't have it. We have it in Prague, but it's a very important topic for us. Public transportation and successful usage in the cities.
But the hallmark of a great library or of any great social infrastructure is that it's accessible. It has to be accessible, and so how you get to a place very much determines how accessible it is in practice, right? If you have an open door policy, but you're located in a place that's very hard for people to reach, it's fundamentally not accessible. And so it's true that one of the virtues of New York and some of the other American cities that have good public transit systems is that people can get to different local institutions. Libraries, we have so many libraries in New York City and in American cities that they really tend to be walkable. Ideally, people use them because they can walk to them. That's kind of the best case. But in a lot of other areas, you need a car, and as soon as you have a system set up where the only way a public good is accessible is if you have a car, then you're setting yourself up for inequality, and you're making the thing less accessible. And I think we have a clear record of that already here.
Yeah. We also have the record that the tram is building a city. So sometimes people ask us why we build or plan trams in the middle of nowhere. But every tram track was in the middle of nowhere at the beginning, and now it's surrounded by the city, city that we like, very dense city, walkable city. So that's the reason why I'm asking about that, because we don't have very often a chance to speak about the transportation and a connection with the quality of the life in United States, because it's always off topic when we have an urban talks with someone from United States. It is not happening very often if we are talking about the transportation. I think that that's all from me. I'm really happy that you joined us. I hope you enjoyed our talk, and I hope we will meet sometime in person, and I will show you our Center for Architecture and Metropolitan Planning, and we will talk about the differences between New York and Prague, for example.
Sounds great. Very nice to see you. I wish you all good luck and good health in the new year.
Yeah, happy Christmas.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. So that was Eric Klinenberg from New York. He's experiencing very huge blizzard, so I hope he will be well, and I hope you enjoyed last Urban Talks of 2020. We will continue next year, so stay with us, check our videos on YouTube and Vimeo, and have a good time. Bye.